Lights, cameras, anti-Mexican racism? In 1915, the lost-caused revisionist film Birth of a Nation had premiered in February of that year. It became a cultural sensation among many white Americans. It was a diatribe against abolition, Reconstruction, and racial equality. Southern enslavers were lionized while dastardly radical Republicans and their emancipated freedmen stooges ran amok. The film's triumphant ending involves the heroic horsebound Ku Klux Klan intimidating black men into not voting. This depiction of the Civil War and Reconstruction eras is among the worst in American film history. The warped pro-Confederate and white supremacist themes are overwhelming. Suffice to say, the Klan during the Reconstruction period were little more than bigoted terrorists. The Klan had actually been put down during the presidential administration of Ulysses S. Grant. However, we are not going over this film, but rather another of a similar nature. Where Birth of a Nation denigrated black Americans and exalted the Ku Klux Klan, another film with a distorted view of history graced the silver screens. It premiered in November 1915. It too extolled white Anglo supremacy, but its chosen demographic of ridicule were Mexicans. It was a historical epic depicting the genesis of a nation, that nation being Texas before its incorporation as a state within the U.S. That silent film was entitled Martyrs of the Alamo. It proudly displayed its alternative title, The Birth of Texas, a symbolic nod of sorts to Birth of a Nation. Welcome to Historical Detour. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Consider pledging to my Patreon. Despite the title, Martyrs of the Alamo actually depicts three major military confrontations of the Texas Revolution: the taking of Bihar, the titular Alamo, and the final battle of San Jacinto. Rather than recapping the entirety of Mexican and early Texas history that inspired the events of Martyrs of the Alamo, I will link some videos that I feel do a good job of summarizing them. However, I will bring up numerous errors and distortions with historical corrections when necessary. Suffice to say, by October 1835, rising tensions between many Anglo-American settlers and the central government of Mexico erupted into open warfare in the Mexican territory of Texas. The end goal of many Anglo-revolutionaries was de facto independence for Texas. This film seeks to tell a racist and mythological footnoted version of these events. Much like The Birth of a Nation, Martyrs had some of the same artists behind it, both in front and behind the camera. D.W. Griffin, who directed Birth of a Nation, was the producer of Martyrs. In the director's chair was Christy Carbane, normally an actor and a frequent Griffin collaborator. A number of actors of Birth of a Nation donned new roles for this project. Sam DeGrasse and Alan Sears, who had worked on Birth of a Nation, took on the roles of Texan fighter Silent Smith and frontiersman David Crockett, respectively. Walter Long, a white man who put on blackface for Birth of a Nation, now portrayed a caricature of the Mexican president and dictator Santa Anna. In fairness to the film, Santa Anna has a well-deserved reputation as a destructive tyrant willing to wage war against his own people. The film was one of the earliest roles of future Hollywood superstar Douglas Fairbanks, albeit this role was not a dignified one. Under blackface makeup, he played an enslaved man listed in the credits as Joe. Historically, an enslaved man owned by William Travis named Joe survived the Alamo. However, the Joe of the film appears to be conflated with the enslaved body servant of Bowie, who likely perished. The screenplay had been written by Theodosia Harris. The historiographies she could draw from of the Texas Revolution were extremely one-sided hagiographies extolling the Anglos and ignored non-white American perspectives. Most glaringly, Mexican primary sources for the Texas Revolution were essentially never consulted, even by professional U.S. scholars. Most glaringly, the Tejanos, Spanish-speaking Texans who aided the Anglos, find no mention or appearance in the film. Any Mexicans shown are little more than hard-drinking and rapacious louts. Another probable reason for the bigoted portrayal of Mexicans was the ongoing Mexican Revolution. This conflict was destabilizing the U.S. border region with Mexico. Various factions at times crossed into American territory to procure arms or plot while in exile. At various points, violent skirmishes occurred with American law enforcement or civilians. This was a time of ruthless American vigilante violence in the Southwest. Many Mexican nationals or Mexican Americans were hastily or even falsely accused of anti-American activities and were summarily executed. The film opens with a text crawl explaining some of the historical buildup of the Texas Revolution. The tyrannical president of Mexico, Santa Anna, has assumed absolute power, and the, quote, liberty-loving Americans who had built up the Texas colony were denied their rights by Santa Anna, end quote. That statement grossly oversimplifies the complexity of this historical reality. While at first many Texan revolutionaries merely desired political or economic freedom, many others wished to seize agricultural lands in order to build plantations maintained with enslaved labor. Slavery being nominally illegal under Mexican law, albeit this law had largely been unenforced for Anglo-Americans. Santa Anna also had sought more centralized control over Texas due to not only fears of revolution, but also potential conflict with the U.S., who might annex Texas. Texas was not the only Mexican territory to revolt in 1835. Numerous Mexican states had rebelled due to Santa Anna repealing the 1824 Liberal Constitution. The 1824 Constitution was actually referenced in many early Texan rebel flags. By October 1835, rebel Texans made their first formal act of defiance to begin the revolution. Mexican dragoons attempted to seize a loaned cannon, and Texan militia opened fire, killing 2 Mexican soldiers. These were the opening shots of the Texas Revolution. That skirmish would be known as the Battle of Gonzales. However, the film skips ahead and ignores this. Other early battles not shown are the initial Texan victories at Goliad, Concepcion, and Fort Lipan-Titlan. The film claims, quote, under the dictator's rule, the honor and life of American womanhood was held in contempt, end quote, in Mexican-held San Antonio. The treatment of Anglo women by Mexican men was not, in fact, a real contributing factor to the revolt. In fact, intermarriage between Anglos and Mexicans was extremely commonplace. This racist falsehood serves no other purpose than to galvanize contemporary anti-Mexican prejudice. Santa Anna is inaccurately portrayed as being already in Texas and headquartered in the Alamo close to the beginning of the Revolution. In reality, he was further south in Mexico, and his several thousand-strong army did not arrive in Texas until February 1836. However, the film soon has him leave San Antonio, and leaves it under the command of his relative Martin Cuss. One of the chief protagonists is the essentially fictional Silent Smith. He appears to be lightly based on the real-life Texan revolutionary Erasmus Death Smith. The Silent Smith of the film is credited as the chief general and conqueror of San Antonio. In reality, the taking of Béjar and San Antonio was masterminded and principally commanded by Texan commanders such as Stephen Austin and Thomas Rusk. The real-life Death Smith was, however, one of the earliest Texas Rangers and a decorated scout. The real Smith participated in both the Long Grass Fight and San Jacinto. Another key character in the film is A.M. Al Marin Dickinson, a Texan revolutionary and eventual artillery captain of the Alamo garrison. His prominent inclusion is unsurprising, as his wife and widow Susanna gave one of the chief Anglo accounts of the Alamo battle. Albeit she gave it orally, and there are discrepancies in her claims with other eyewitness accounts. The first major battle shown is the Battle of Béjar. The Mexican San Antonio garrison are shown as brutes who continually abuse and harass Anglo civilians. A rapid assault by Texan forces forces the surrender of the Mexican commander, Martin Cuss. In reality, the siege was a grueling affair. After several weeks surrounding the Mexican garrison, Texan forces began a bloody, days-long street-by-street fight. The Texans forced the capitulation and retreat of the garrison by December 1835. Now we come to the subject of the 3 principal Alamo commanders: William Travis, Jim Bowie, and David Crockett. Completely removed from the film is the initial Alamo garrison leader, John C. Neal. Neal was absent during the famous Alamo siege due to attempting to procure further men and supplies. In fact, it was Neal that convinced Bowie of the necessity of holding the Alamo, rather than abandon it as had initially been suggested by Texan leader Sam Houston. Jim Bowie, though born in Kentucky, had arrived in Texas in 1830 and had acclimated quite well to life in Mexican Texas. Bowie had bought property, managing textile mills, and even marrying into a prominent local Mexican family. Alas, his wife and their children had died of cholera in 1833. Bowie had successfully commanded men in both the battles of Concepcion and the Grass Fight. However, soon after being appointed leader of the Alamo due to Neal's absence, Bowie grew gravely ill and was handicapped in his abilities. The coonskin-capped Crockett is shown as being in Texas in time for the storming of San Antonio. In reality, Crockett did not arrive at San Antonio or the Alamo mission until early February 1836, after its capture by Texan forces. Crockett had under his nominal command some 30 Tennessee volunteers who arrived at the Alamo as reinforcements. Finally, we come to William Travis, who, despite his mere 26 years of age, was an avid war hawk for the Texan cause. He had first arrived in Mexican Texas in 1831. Travis was a failed and debt-ridden lawyer from the U.S. South. Travis soon abandoned his wife and children for Texas. Travis was soon made a lieutenant colonel of the fledgling Texas Regulars. He was soon ordered to the Alamo to take command of the garrison with some 30 regular cavalry. The reasons that the Texans were organizing at the Alamo is that Santa Anna was rapidly marching toward San Antonio to reclaim the city and put to the sword those who he saw as treacherous rebels. However, there were simply not enough regulars or volunteers to properly man the walls of the Alamo mission. Accurately shown is an initial disagreement between Travis and Bowie as to who would be the overall commander of the garrison. A compromise was mediated between the two, as Travis would command the regulars and Bowie the irregular volunteers. The illness of Bowie, however, rapidly caused Travis to assume de facto command. The siege and battle of the Alamo in the film is shown as almost taking place immediately after the capture of San Antonio. However, it took several weeks for Santa Anna's forces to arrive in late February. The panicked preparations and evacuations of numerous civilians to the Alamo once Santa Anna arrives, however, are quite accurate. Additionally, another accuracy shown in the film is that by early 1836, the revolutionaries' initial demand of full Texan statehood and political representation in Mexico's National Assembly had shifted toward full separation and independence of a Texan country. Only 180 odd men are estimated to have defended the Alamo. All the defenders in the film, however, are depicted as white Anglos. Numerous Mexican Tejanos were also present under the command of Juan Seguin, a military captain of Hispanic Tejas origin who carried dispatches to Allied Texan forces. Seguin would attempt to bring reinforcements, but alas was too late in aiding his comrades. Additionally, outside of black men such as Joe, other black enslaved people at the Alamo are nowhere to be seen or mentioned. This is despite several enslaved people being eyewitness survivors. The Hispanic Tejano and black absence is whitewashing to a revolting degree. In the film, the Texans make no attempt to surrender or negotiate with Santa Anna. However, the reality was a bit more complicated. Originally, the Mexicans hoisted a red flag of no quarter to the Texan garrison. Bowie independently sent a representative to attempt a negotiated surrender. A defiant Travis, however, sent another man to countermand this. However, once it was clear Santa Anna wanted nothing more than an unconditional surrender, Travis and Bowie together fired a cannon shot at the Mexicans. The Alamo siege proper begins. The film shows the Mexicans attempting an initial disastrous assault on the Alamo, with dozens dying. This isn't an exaggeration of minor early siege skirmishes that had resulted in several Mexican deaths to one defender. Towards the end of the siege, Travis is shown as drawing a line in the sand, asking those who would cross it to join him in resisting to the end. Whether this truly happened or is a mythical addition to the battle's lore is uncertain. Another glaring inaccuracy of the film is Silent Smith being shown as the last courier out of the Alamo. In fact, the historical Smith had been sent out by Travis before the siege and later returned nearly a week after the Alamo's fall. It is in fact fiercely argued who was the last man sent out of the Alamo as a courier. The film also portrays the Texan army of Sam Houston as being unaware of the true danger the Alamo was in. Many modern reappraisals have assessed Houston as being well aware that the Alamo was doomed. Houston did not send additional aid to the Alamo to pragmatically preserve his manpower. Also ignored is the abortive attempt by Texan Colonel Fannin to send hundreds of reinforcements to the siege. However, some volunteers had arrived in the midst of the Alamo to aid the beleaguered defenders. Nonetheless, the Alamo garrison was greatly outnumbered. In the film, the final Mexican assault begins. The film shows it as happening in the middle of the day, all the defenders prepared and at their stations. In real life, it was barely morning of the 13th day of the siege. Mexican scouts had managed to kill Texan outlooks who had fallen asleep. The resulting final battle was a bloody mess. starting as a gun and cannon shot exchange that soon devolved into a brutal melee of knives and bayonets. Figures for the casualty count are highly disputed between Mexican and Texan sources. Official Mexican reports list their losses as 60 dead and hundreds wounded. The Texan defenders were essentially annihilated, however. Fascinatingly, this film has some of the defenders being captured and summarily executed. This is in contrast with many later depictions that have all of the defenders going down fighting. Another contested aspect of the Alamo is if any of the defenders attempted to flee, as a number of defenders were likely killed outside the walls. They had most likely been running to escape certain death. Travis, Bowie, and Crockett are portrayed as dying during the final stand itself. Travis certainly did. Bowie was probably slain in his sickbed if he was still alive at that point. Crockett's fate is the most controversial. The heroic narrative has him dying in battle. However, some Mexican accounts have him being captured with a handful of other defenders. Santa Anna ordered the surrendered men murdered. Crockett was likely among these heinously treated men. The film shows the devastated widow Dickinson leaving the Alamo with her young daughter. Ignored by the film, however, Santa Anna, in one of his few genuine acts of mercy during the battle, allowed all surviving women, children, and adult enslaved people to leave. Albeit this also served to spread word of his military success. Many of the real-life survivors of the Alamo were Tejanos or African American. Their omission is unsurprising for this whitewashed work. The film is split roughly into 3 acts. The Battle of Behar was Act 1. The Alamo was Act 2. Finally, we come to Act 3, the Battle of San Jacinto. The film heavily condenses the timeline from the Alamo's fall to the decisive Battle of San Jacinto. Santa Anna's forces, particularly those under José de Urrea, went on the warpath, and a string of Mexican victories followed. Most infamously, after securing the surrender of Texan forces in Fort Defiance at Goliad, Santa Anna ordered the execution of over 400 unarmed POWs. Also among the executed was their commander, Fannin. That Mexican atrocity is ironically not depicted or mentioned. Houston's Texan force, meanwhile, was consciously avoiding a pitched battle while employing a strategy in retrospect dubbed the runaway scrape. As with the Fabian strategy with Hannibal, and Kutuzov with Napoleon, Sam Houston burned what he could not carry, extending a war of attrition to weaken Santa Anna and allow his ramshackle army more time to train. Now, back to the film. Santa Anna's well-attested womanizing is morphed into him being, quote, an inveterate drug fiend, the dictator of Mexico, also famous for his shameful orgies, end quote. Silent Smith is once again assigned a fictional role, going undercover as a game hunter to spy on the Mexican army, and also wishing to rescue his captured beloved from the clutches of Santa Anna. The Battle of San Jacinto in the film is shown as a lightning-fast surprise attack on the Mexican camp. In real life, both sides spent some time maneuvering around one another, albeit Santa Anna did so poorly, being in disadvantageous ground. Once battle was joined, however, the battle was over in roughly 18 minutes in favor of Houston's Texans. The film claims that the Texas battle cry was "Remember the Alamo." This is true, but also common was the saying, "Remember the Goliad," in retribution for the hundreds of executed Texan prisoners. Santa Anna in the film is in the company of immodest women when he decides to disguise himself in a common soldier's jacket. However, he is recognized and taken into Texan custody. This is somewhat close to real life, but one key difference is that he was found the following day. What gave away his identity was the clear astonishment and salutes of other captured Mexican soldiers. The film claims Houston had broken his leg falling from his horse. In real life, Houston was shot in the ankle during the battle and thus had to receive Santa Anna laying on the ground, recuperating under blankets. With little choice, Santa Anna signed a surrender agreement granting Texan independence. This is rather accurately shown in the movie. An end slide claims that Susanna Dickinson was, quote, the sole surviving widow who could not forget at what a price victory came, end quote. A conscious spit in the face to numerous other survivors. This is a true prequel to Birth of a Nation. The attempted distortion of history and willful removal of inconvenient facts are mirrored in one another. The intent of a triumphalist white supremacist narrative is undeniable in both films. If you want a far better depiction of Texas's founding, the 2004 Alamo film is worth a watch. A palate-cleansing work that looks at the Alamo history and remembrance critically is Forget the Alamo.